Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Hi, my name is Yelena Ledra, and I work with the Monash City Council as the Free From Violence project officer. For those who are listening to the webinar, I have straight brown hair pinned back. My eyes are blue, and I'm wearing a black top and silver earrings. Thank you for coming along to this webinar, and it's such an important topic that we would like to talk today. This webinar, Start the Conversation, Family Violence Prevention is Everyone's Business, is a part of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign, and we organized this event in partnership between Knox, Maroondah and Monash councils. A quick note to start with is that we are recording this session today, and as soon as the recording will be available, we will share by the email with everyone who is registered. We have closed captions through the option through the taskbar. So if you need that option, please click it. And I'd like to start the webinar with the acknowledgement of the country. Maroondah, Knox and Monash councils are working and operating on Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Burunurong peoples nations of Kulin Nation, and we would like to acknowledge them as traditional custodians of the land on which we operate. We have people also joining today from different lands and from different locations, so we would like to acknowledge traditional owners of everyone joining us today, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Tonight, we are also acknowledging the terrible impact of family violence on families and communities and the strength and resilience of those who have and are still experiencing family violence. We want to thank those who have publicly shared their stories and done an immense amount of advocacy to shape Victoria's and Australian response. We pay respects to those who didn't survive and also to their families and friends. We acknowledge that it is a deeply personal and challenging topic for many people to discuss. If you're finding the content difficult, please know that we will have the recording available and support services numbers are available in the chat. If you're in immediate danger, please call 000, and also 1-800-RESPECT is the services that you can get support from. We will also email a follow-up email after this event with all different services available for community. We had an incredible interest in this event and received a very large amount of questions. So we will make sure that the panelists today will respond to as many questions as possible. But of course, the time may limit the number of questions that we potentially answer and cover today. There is a Q&A function in the toolbar below where you can post your question as well. And we would like to remind you that this webinar is a respectful and safe space for everyone. And we would like to ask everyone to treat each other and present us kindly with respect and have considerations when you posting your thoughts and questions. And finally, I would like to welcome Patricia Karvelas, who is a prominent Australian journalist, television and radio host, podcaster, political journalist, and a commentator. I'm sure you have seen her hosting Q&A, Australia's debate on big issues on Monday nights, read her articles, posts, and heard her on ABC radio. And I'm sure she doesn't need the introduction because she's well known. Patricia will be moderating today's event. Welcome, Patricia, and over to you.
Thank you, Yelena, and welcome everybody to this Start the Conversation webinar. I am Patricia Karvelas, for those who don't know me, I have a particular passion in this issue, and I think tonight's going to be a really important discussion to try and start the conversation and really take it forward if we can. Now, we know that family violence prevention is everyone's business. Every single member of the community has a stake in making this, our families, our homes, our workplaces, better and safer places for all people, and crucially, of course, for women. Every 10 minutes, the statistics are pretty startling. Partners and family members killed a woman or a girl intentionally in 2023. The crisis of gender-based violence is incredibly urgent. There is no excuse for violence, no explanation. It must stop, and women and girls have the right to live and live safe lives. The 16 days of activism is an opportunity to really revitalise commitments in many ways, and we'll be having that discussion tonight with our excellent panellists. What can we individually do? What are your questions, which we'll get into a little later? And they're pretty important because the questions you have, we want to drive tonight's conversation, not just the questions I have for our excellent panellists. Important that we mention how important it is as we approach the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action in 2025. It's a blueprint for achieving gender equality for women and girls everywhere. And I want to introduce our three panellists tonight. And I'm going to begin, if I can, with Professor JaneMaree Maher, she, her, are her pronouns. She's worked with and learned from students at Monash University for more than 20 years. Her research is focused on hearing from those affected by family violence and gender discrimination. And Professor JaneMaree Maher, welcome. We're also joined tonight by Julianne. She's also uses the pronoun she, her. She's an experienced advocate and activist with lived experience of domestic violence, child sexual abuse, homelessness, disability, and the long-term impacts of childhood trauma. And we know, as we will explore tonight, that these issues are often linked, and they obviously do have ramifications for each other, and there's a lot of crossover. She's a member of several working groups and committees, and she's committed to bringing voices of women with lived experience to the table, which is a particular focus at the moment, actually hearing from people who are survivors and have lived through this kind of violence to give us the expertise about what is needed to kind of shift the dial and help people and turn it around. And finally, my third panellist, if I can welcome him, Trent Larkman. He, him, is a passionate educator and consultant specialising in fostering safer and more inclusive cultures with workplaces and sporting clubs by preventing and addressing gendered violence, harassment and discrimination. He's got a background in men's family violence and that particular sector. His work is grounded in reflective, ethics-driven approach, with his work striving to engage individuals and organisations in challenging what are entrenched gender norms and power structures to build equitable and respectful communities. Please welcome our three panellists tonight. I'm very excited to pick their brains and to ensure that their experience and their considerable knowledge of this area is able to help you wherever you might be joining us tonight. And I know it's not just Victoria. I want to acknowledge traditional owners as well. We've got people from across the country who are joining us. Let's get into it and begin with you if we can, Trent. Tell me about your work in primary prevention and specifically your past work, which I think has really informed a lot of what you know in terms of working with men.
Yeah, most certainly. Thank you, Patricia, for that lovely introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Just quickly, I'll just take a moment to describe myself for anybody who might be listening in tonight or have accessibility needs. I am a white man with a shaved head. I'm wearing brown-rimmed glasses and a blue collared shirt. And yes, I'm dialing in from Gadigal country. I'm up in Sydney. I'm from Melbourne though. I'm a Melbourneian at heart, but I came up to New South Wales for the warm weather, but alas, it's been raining all day up here too. back to your question, my background. In a nutshell, I started off, as a volunteer men's family violence counsellor, and I really fell in love with that work of working with men and supporting them to make changes in their life, to be safer in their communities and homes. I did that for a number of years. Before then, I really found a love and passion for training and education, which is what I do now. And at some point there, I transitioned as well from the family violence response sector into the primary prevention sector, which I really love and is kind of what I do full time now, is around trying to facilitate conversations, as you said in my intro, with sporting clubs and workplaces, trying to prevent violence from occurring or before it occurs. I think in Australia, we have such a rich history of primary prevention campaigns. I'm always reminded of the Slip, Slop, Slap campaign. If you went to school in the 90s or 2000s, everybody knows that saying. And it's a great example of the ways that the whole of society, all of community, schools, sporting clubs, adults, children, everyone kind of took responsibility for this social issue, trying to prevent skin cancers. And I think about it provides a real lens and insight into what we can do with family violence if we really invest in primary prevention and start to try and address this issue before it occurs.
Trent, just a follow-up question to the slip, slop, slap analogy, which I think is a really interesting one. Are we there yet? Are we at the point where that kind of concept of everyone's responsible, this is constantly in our consciousness, are we there yet?
I mean, I don't know if it's a point where we arrive. I think where our primary prevention sector is expanding and growing and the evidence base is evolving. As it evolves, it then allows practitioners to learn how we can translate these ideas to people in communities in a better, more effective way. So we're certainly on the road. As skin cancers still occur, it's a process. These things can take a long time, but I think where we've come over, even the last 10 years, it's almost been a decade since the Royal Commission into Family Violence in Victoria. We've come a long way in 10 years. And so I hope in another 10 years, again, we can take some big strides forward in addressing family violence and its drivers and causes.
Julianne, I want to bring you in. You, of course, have, dedicated your lifelong passion and work to preventing violence against others because you are a survivor and you have such a acute lived experience with this. Just tell me about what your background is and how that's informed the way that you approach this in an intergenerational way and its impacts on children.
I definitely think it starts way back in childhood, that for myself anyway, with a lot of gender stereotype roles. Like I was the only girl out of 5 children, 4 older brothers. So things were very sort of out of balance there. But also, just the things that led me into violent relationships. And I think childhood actually primed me for this. So I think my mission is to do a lot of education. I think it's a lot about learning about yourself as much as you can, as well as the drivers of violence.
And the impact on children you just mentioned, that of course has such strong intergenerational links. Just reflect on the journey to trying to break that, right? Because that's of course at the centre of so much of your work. How have you thought about that on your own journey?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard when you see your own children doing exactly the same as what you've done. And that can come with a lot of guilt, but it also comes with a lot of insight, and seeing it from not you, but watching your child go through the same thing. It gives you a whole different view, and it's almost why you're trying to impart your wisdom to them. You're actually teaching yourself at the same time. So it's really, really powerful. And like in my own situation with my 3 children, there was a 10-year gap between the first and the next 2. And the first one went through the worst of my domestic violence with me. And so she was the most affected because it was quite a long time, whereas the other 2 were affected, but much less than what she was. So So getting in early to what kids are exposed to, I think, could really go a long way, because you just repeat patterns that you see as a child. So there's a lot that goes into that as well, but I think we'll get into that a little bit further on.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. JaneMaree, you work at Monash University. In the introduction, I talked about how your entire career you've dedicated to research here. What's the research that you've worked on? What is it showing you?
You cited, Patricia, at the beginning some really challenging statistics about the number of deaths through family violence every single year, every 10 minutes. And I think the thing that research is really working to uncover is that underneath that there's an absolute set of everyday experiences, of impacts that we don't yet see and we don't know. So I think, in a sense, research is making the journey with everyone, with survivors like Julianne who tell us their stories and explain what it is. But we are at the beginning of a long process of understanding, and I want to begin my part by acknowledging that I too am on the lands of the people of the Kulin Nations, acknowledge their custodianships of the land, air and waters that sustain us all, pay my respects to all First Nations people listening, and a special shout out to the First Nations women who do such incredible advocacy and work in this space. And it's really challenging because they're dealing with the layers of colonialism and they're dealing with the layers of not being believed by police. And so I think that it's a really important, we acknowledge the country and we acknowledge the way that it's lived. I do think Trent's right in saying that we have come a long way, but I think the stats and the research does show we've really got the job in front of us, and we have to keep pushing and we have to keep going. We have to think about how we can support different groups of people who experience violence. We have to get much better at responding. And we all have a job there in terms of listening, hearing, not judging, checking out the stuff that's available about the myths and the biases. Julianne, you talked about gender stereotypes being a part of it, and they are such a part of our conversations. So just to feed into it, for those listening, I've got white hair, bright lipstick and glasses that I'm hoping are a little bit groovy. And so you'll make a picture from that, and that will be part of how you listen to me. And we all have to kind of accept the responsibility for that. So I think research is in partnership with survivors, is really telling us that this is really widespread and we've got a lot of work to continue to do.
And in that research, if I can just stay with you, JaneMaree, what are the survivors telling you in that body of work that you have been researching about what we've got wrong and what we need to be doing?
So I think survivors very often talk about disbelief and a poor response. They sometimes talk about family or cultural stories that say, oh, look, a bit of rubbish in a relationship's pretty expected. They talk about making reports sometimes to fantastic effect. They also talk about making reports which send them back for 5 years. And a really important thing they say is there's not enough money to support effective and safe transition out. Julianne talked about experiences of homelessness. We know that this is absolutely widespread, and that it's great when the government announces $80 million or $100 million for this, but services that do the work need 5 years of funding that keeps on flowing to them so they can employ workers, they can support them, and they can do the kind of response that we need. I think survivors show us incredible resilience and strength. They do an extraordinary job walking a walk. We need to get better at helping them fill their knapsacks and supporting them while they do that.
Trent, what do the statistics tell us about who experiences violence and the types of violence they experience and who they are?
I mean, JaneMaree started to touch on it there, that the evidence is so important. I mean, as a kind of central point, I always look towards the Australian Bureau of Statistics Personal Safety Survey data. That's a nice population level data set that is fairly bias free. It doesn't tell the whole story. It certainly tells us, gives us a pretty good picture. From that most recent personal safety survey, which they come out every couple of years, we can really see the way that violence occurs in a very gendered way, and it's a very gendered issue. And by that, we can see when we look at who's experiencing violence and who uses violence, we see very clear contrast for men and women's experiences of violence. Particularly where we look at where people are most at risk of experiencing violence. When we look at men, men do experience a lot of violence in our community. However, they're most likely to experience that violence in a public place from a person who's a stranger, and that stranger is statistically most likely to be a man. So that's where men are most unsafe. When we look at women's experience, though, women are also most likely to experience violence from a man. However, this time it's a man that is known to them, so a friend or a family member, and they're most likely to experience that violence within their own home. And so even that, just as a very simple kind of stat, the impact that would have on someone would have on women, that feeling of being most unsafe within their home has a huge impact, I think. When we break it down a little bit further, we look at who's using violence. In that same personal safety survey data set, 94% of women and 95% of men, when they experience violence and harm, they experience it at the hands of a man. Yeah, so that's not saying that 95% of men are using violence. We know it's not all men, but we know when violence is used statistically at that population level data set, it is most likely to be a man. And I think the numbers are really important. As I said, they paint us a picture, but there's also a lot of gaps with the statistics. And I think the gaps really, in my mind, are around the impacts of the violence, right? And so when we, hear people's stories, when we hear victim survivors' stories, we're also able to understand the ways that women are much, much more likely to have long-term impacts of fear, anxiety, and really fearing for one's life at the hands of a man's violence. And certainly when I think back to my practice experience working with men who were using violence towards their partners, they would often tell me stories about how their partners did things to them. And of course, that's not okay. But very, very rarely, if ever, did I hear the ways that they would be petrified or fearful for their life. And I think that impact, not only are the stats wildly disproportionate, but the impact and the experience of the violence is always also very different. And so that's not, of course, not to discount anyone's or to minimize any use of violence, but I think that nuance is important for us to understand and recognize.
And Trent, in your work with men in trying to identify why they used violence, what are the sort of drivers? What are we finding about men being able to identify what's happening for them?
I mean, what's a simple way I can answer that question for you? Maybe a nice kind of way to answer that is when we look at men's family violence response programs, so the programs that support men after they have used violence, support those men to change. They then look at those programs and go, all right, the men that are going into these programs, do they work? Yes or no? They can work. They don't work for all men, but they work for many men. And then the important question is what about the programs is working? What's supporting those men to change? And the answer to that is that men who are able to look at ideas and look at themselves and unpack ideas of male privilege and male entitlement, those men were the ones who were deemed to take the most steps towards becoming safer within the home and more respectful. So I share that because it's a bit of a backwards answer in terms of what's driving it. In many ways, it's ideas of these really rigid ideas of what it means to be a man. These very constraining ideas of how men should be in the world, and attached to that is ideas of male entitlement and male privilege, which really entrench those beliefs. That's a short answer. I hope I explained that.
It's excellently articulated, and I want to bring you in, Julianne. Does that resonate with you? You mentioned gender roles and you know, even your family structure growing up, brothers, the kind of the patriarchal kind of building blocks of a family. Does what Trent say resonate with you, that gender roles was part of what you experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, it's been different for different generations. So going back to my generation, it was still quite traditional roles. So, you know, girls sort of weren't going to amount to much, especially if you had a learning disability like I did. So I was never going to be a scholar. I only did primary school. I did about 3 weeks of first year of high school and left because I just couldn't function, and went and got a job in a childcare centre. And other than that, it was just factory work. But there was never any sort of goal for me. It was like, you know, you'll just become a mum and look after the house. And also from an era where parents used to put down their kids, hoping that they would then do the opposite. And there's a lot of damaged people, women and men. But, you know, we all know that, you know, boys don't cry, don't be a sook, don't be a girl. That everything from childhood really starts to shape you as an adult. So, you know, I think we have come a long way in some areas like that. So most people don't tend to do that so much these days. But then there's also the problems of kids do what they see, and sometimes it's not intentional. It's just a reaction. If they've always seen their father react angrily or in a certain way, they will naturally just start doing that. So, you know, it's that exposure to long-term violence is really bad for kids. And even when you leave, if your kids are young, you might think that, yeah, that, you know, like I've got them through that rough patch. But then once they turn into teenagers and hormones kicking, and they start adding up all the dots from the past. And so a new wave of emotion comes by in the teenage years. And I think if you're not aware of that and you don't give them some other kind of outlet, then I think it's really going to affect them as adults.
Julianne, I just want to stay with you and talk just for a moment about family violence and disability. How does that kind of violence get used against women living with disability?
Yeah, so the statistics are higher for women with disabilities. There's all sorts of scenarios for women with disabilities. A lot of the time, their partners or carers are the perpetrators. They might feel it would be way too hard to leave their partner, who is also their carer, so they choose to just put up with it. You have a lot of people who might see that there is domestic violence going on, but they'll excuse it and say, geez, it must be really hard to look after someone with a disability, like, you know, and just totally excuse the situation. I've heard of perpetrators removing communication devices so they can't have contact with the outside world, removing mobility devices so they actually can't leave the property, using the disability against them, such as, you know, a woman with a intellectual disability, using that against her in fights and telling her she's stupid, she doesn't know what she's talking about, things like that. So, yeah, there's a whole different kind of domestic violence for women with disabilities.
JaneMaree, back to the research element here, and I really want our webinar that we're trying to start a conversation, right? And people in this webinar want some solutions, want some tangible action. And so when Julianne mentions that kind of extra layers of control and lack of control and agency that women in this situation are facing, what are some of the broadest societal changes do you think that we can make to address these issues? We've got a question, for instance, from a member of the webinar who's asked, what impact does systemic inequality and social injustice have on the prevalence of violence, and what steps should be taken to address those issues as well to help lift women out of these situations?
So I was thinking, as Julianne was talking, that's exactly right, that women with disability often have less access to funds, they often have less access to stable work, it's very hard to get into good housing, and we know that all of those things intensify the risk of being exposed to violence or being caught, as Julianne said, not being able to go anywhere. So I think we do need to look at social and economic injustice really significantly. And one of the things we haven't talked about yet that I think is important is the way that social media algorithms drive particular conversations for particular cohorts of people. So one of the things that we're seeing in research is that young men are being exposed to a lot of, your Andrew Tate, your Jordan Peterson, the manosphere, it's sometimes called, although that does seem like some kind of a shaving situation. But it's actually a fairly dark discussion that undercuts a whole lot of the gender equality steps that we've made and a whole lot of images and ideas that we've really all been working hard for. So I think it's recognising that there's conversations going on in a range of different places. And I think if people in those conversations don't feel connected to their community, if boys don't feel there's places for them to be good, if they don't feel they can be seen as good citizens and good actors, they're more likely to be caught up in a in a discussion of dispossession and someone's got stuff that I haven't got. And I think we see that really replicated for a whole lot of groups. The other thing, of course, about technology, and this is perhaps a practical thing, that, keeping your phone and your passwords for yourself and orderly as you begin in relationships. It's hard not to get suspicious when you work for a long time in the areas that we're working in, but it's really smart to hold some independence and some security in some of those things, because we really now know that perpetrators, who, as Julianne described, they're an adaptable group sometimes, aren't they, Julianne? They look for what's going to happen, what's going to create an effect. So there's tracking devices on phones, there's monitorings, there's, all those sorts of things. There's being in social media, there's using your social media accounts. So I guess it's just, thinking about independence and connection to your community at the same time, which is an extremely hard job to do, actually.
Yeah, there's actually a question that's come through. It's the first question that's come through that I just think I have to bring in now because it goes to that point. And it's, would it be a good idea to teach healthy behaviours and expectations in schools around boundaries? And I think boundaries just there is what you're really alluding to.
Yes.
Controlling your own life and agenda. I mean, my great grandmother in the suburbs always used to say to me, always control your own money, have your own car. I know what she was talking about now. Like as a teen girl, I was like, why does this woman bang on about this stuff? And that's what she was talking about, right? Control.
Yeah.
That we need to start setting those parameters really early.
We do. So I think, the moves in schools to do respectful relationships, to talk about those things early, to talk to toddlers and say, my body, my space. I don't like that. Who's your safe adult? Those sorts of things are actually ways of giving people agency, the ability to act and not to feel caught, because there is help and support. But one of the things that happens immediately as you begin to be coerced is you start to retreat and you try and respond to the kind of you try and make yourself safe and in some ways smaller. So your great-grandmother was exactly right. And there was some fantastic work done by Donna Chung in Adelaide a while ago. And she talked to 14 and 15-year-olds heading into their first relationships. And the boy said, I have to look after her. That's my job. And the girl said, oh, I have to let him look after me. That's my job. And it would be great if we said that's not the job, actually. Two people coming together, you look after each other a bit, you let each other go a bit, you fundamentally be respectful. You know, those I absolutely think we have to begin there, and we probably have to keep going, because that's a conversation we have to have all through the life course with ourselves and with others.
Trent, does that resonate with you, that sort of early boundaries, expectations, talking about it at a much earlier level, and that's the prevention part of the story?
Yeah, it is. The thing that jumps to mind, though, is the complexities of it. You know, as an educator, we can go in and deliver incredible programs and teach and talk about those ideas. But the change we're looking for needs to be organizational and structural. You know, so we might go in and do a great program, but do all the teachers in that school, do they understand how to talk about this stuff? Are they unintentionally potentially reinforcing the same gender stereotypes that we're trying to teach, you know, the students about? So there are certainly complexities, and for me, primary prevention is about a whole of community. You know, everybody needs to be relearning and doing this work, and work in schools is certainly part of that. And you know, it often gets says primary prevention needs to happen in all the places we live, learn, play, work, and socialize, because this is where these ideas, these gendered stereotypes, as Julianne mentioned earlier, reproduced and entrenched, right?
And inextricably linked to potential violence, but not always violence, right? It's a trajectory for some and not for others, but either way, it can be very damaging. Julianne, I just want to address with you, as somebody with lived experience, the kind of healing from family violence and support. I mean, the journey takes time. It often takes a long time, actually. Just talk to me about how your healing journey started.
I think my healing journey was definitely in parts. It's almost like a novel with lots of chapters. So I think at the very, very early stages was literally just being able to keep my body alive. I would have to focus on breathing, eating, drinking, and pretty much that's all I could do after the sexual assault. After that stage, I had pretty bad agoraphobia, so I didn't leave the house. So I started to create a life for myself inside the house, which was really tricking myself because I was still inside. But I did start to let people in. And I'd been in 3 domestic violent relationships, and I couldn't figure out why I kept having these relationships. And after 3, I was like, obviously it must be me. With all my childhood abuse, and then like I was in an adult relationship from the age of 14, and you know, the first time I was pregnant, 15, second time, 16. So really, really young, no schooling, no nothing, pretty much no parenting either. So I really didn't know what I was meant to be like. So being on my own and starting to sort through my own thoughts. But one of the 2 key things for me was I came across a pilot program for a domestic violent recovery group, and I had no idea what that would be. So I went along, and the first few weeks was learning what is domestic violence, and there I realised it was, you know, like I hadn't just been physically and sexually abused, I'd had all these other kinds of abuses as well. So it was a big eye-opener. And I always see my partner as, no, nobody else knows how bad this person is. And then when I was listening to the other women, I'm like, hang on, were they all given a book at birth or something? Because all these behaviors are like exactly the same. And learning the cycle of violence, you know, like it will explode and then how it gets better and you live off these crumbs that you're given. So I think once I started to understand the psychology of that entrapment, once I knew it, that it was a myth and it was just control, I was able to break it. So that was great for me. My eldest daughter, though, she, you know, like the long-term effects of violence for her, she ended up with drug and alcohol problems, mental health problems, experienced her own homelessness and actually died in a boarding house. Because unfortunately, we have to put women and children first, but then there's this whole sector of women, single, who aren't being taken care of and aren't in housing. So that and being part of the community, that was quite slow. The kids started going to a local youth group. Then I started, you know, just saying, hey, I'm the parent and starting to talk to people. That was really good, having people accepting some kindness in my life. That was really good. And I think the biggest thing for me was something I heard a long time ago, and that was people who say they die for their kids. And it's like, that's not what your kids need. We live for your kids. And for me, it was too late with my eldest daughter. And I was a very young mum, and looking back, I can see a multitude of mistakes, and unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about that. But it was like, okay, my kids are looking at me as this broken woman, and I imagined them as me, whereas like, where's my role model? I don't know what to be. So then I started to get stronger, and I wanted to show them that you can actually come back, you can survive it. And I think that was a real big deal breaker in my kids' lives. You know, my kids were affected, but I think having that knowledge and showing them, actually being that example to them, how you can be strong and how you can get yourself back no matter what's happened. I think that was probably a big accomplishment for me. So yeah, then the journey was I started wanting to share with other women. I started running women's groups from home again. And then COVID happened. And it was not long after my daughter had died, and I went down a hill once again. And then I got an opportunity to be a part of a panel with Margins to the Mainstream. And I never thought about advocating. Like, I have all this stuff. I thought there was nothing that I could do. I had no education. Like, it was sort of over for me. I'm just going to sit here until I die, sort of thing. And I started doing the advocating, and yeah, I just love it. And I think this is what I'll do for the rest of my life.
Julianne, you're very good at it. So I'm glad that you're doing it. It's very powerful hearing you speak at being able to identify these cycles and being able to break them. Was the first step the hardest, being able to put your hand up and, as you say, take kindness, go take yourself to a meeting?
Well,
is that very difficult?
One of the problems is sometimes leaving can be just as bad or worse than staying when you've got children. You know, we were put in a different motel every night. We actually flee from interstate, so that was quite difficult in itself. I had agoraphobia. I'd just been sexually assaulted. My daughter had drug and alcohol issues. My kids had PTSD. My grandson was showing signs of PTSD and autism. And it was like, how do I fix all these people, so I just had to keep pushing my crap down and just deal with what was in front of me. There was plenty of times where I thought, what am I doing? The kids, this is damaging to them. You know, they're not in regular schooling. We're moving from place to place. They're starting to squabble from being in a very closed environment. A multitude of problems. And there were so many times I nearly gave up, but it was still better than them being exposed to it long term. So I think we need to be really aware of how bad it is sometimes for a woman to leave. And, you know, you've got them children going, Mum, I want to go home. I want to see Dad. I want my bed. I want my, and you've got to be so strong to commit. And I think sometimes that's why it takes women up to 8 times, because it's not easy. So I think if we can do a lot more work about how we make it a bit easier for women to be able to leave, or for women to be able to stay and the man to leave. I mean,
Yes.
Ideal world.
Yeah, very, very powerfully said. Thank you for sharing that. JaneMaree, how does this story of recovery help other women recover? Women are clearly very empowered by hearing stories like this. It gives them an idea of what the pathways might look like.
I think Julianne's kind of unflinching honesty in the face of really hard stuff does such a service. And Julianne, you said, you know, there was a moment where you were thinking to yourself, oh, this must be me. And then you listened to other women and you went, oh, did they have a book? Have they been in a chat room and working out? And I think some of that stuff is absolutely critically important. I think, you know, I was thinking of the Indigenous women's families in the Northern Territory who, you know, supported an inquest into the lives of their daughters and their mother, and in order that people could see and understand. And all of those acts are really about trying to move the responsibility to where it belongs. It's, you know, it's not the shame of the person who's experienced these things, which I think is still something we hear and we see and is part of women's experiences. It's the shame of the person who's perpetrating, who needs to be given the responsibility, as you said, Julianne, shoofed it off and said, this is just not okay. And that needs to be a message that a survivor holds really tightly. But we all have a job in absolutely supporting that. In if a woman returns because she's been in a motel room for 4 days and she hasn't got enough nappies, that's not a cause for judgment. That's a cause for all of us to work out how we get some more nappies organised, how we support, how we be present in that. And I think the story of the 8 times and the lack of safety when you leave, Julianne, are just so important to share, because I often think people do see this as a binary state. It's not, especially if you have children. It's never going to be a binary state. And some part of, I think, what women are always trying to do is to hold a space for the father in the child's life, even though the father is kind of a perpetrator. It's a huge job, and everyone bringing really serious ears, no judgment, and thinking about the resources that you can bring. Small things, information. You know, Julianne talked about coming across a piece of paper. I've heard that story over and over, that someone said something and 6 months later someone goes, oh, maybe that's somewhere I could go. You know, In Touch has family violence information in all different languages in Victoria, so you can download and get definitions. Again, I've heard that story of that piece of information that is not the journey, because as you said, Julianne, the journey is a long journey, but it's a bit of a resource to start, and it might come at a time when you can walk forward in one way or another.
Trent, you mentioned gender equality earlier, and it's come up in all of everyone's contributions, right? So I suppose the big question here, given we all have to live together, is what can men do? What can men do in this whole story?
The $6 million question, hey? I've only got a few minutes.
I thought I'd give it to you as a Trent.
I've only got a few minutes as well, but I think, it's funny. I was just reflecting. I have a list of things that I think men can do, but I was kind of sitting here listening to Julianne before, and I get nervous before these talks all the time, and then I hear hear women like Julianne tell their stories. I just feel kind of humbled, and I really appreciate, the bravery and honesty that takes, Julianne, and it's an honor to kind of share a space with people. And where my mind went from there is that, men need to listen to women. Yeah, they need to listen to their experiences. They need to hear them. These are not concepts to be debated about. These are people's lived experiences. And I think, lots of the men that I'm working with, this has kind of been a new thing that I'm understanding to help me in my practice and how I talk about this with men. There's a point where we can talk about ideas, but then there's also a point where we need to recognize people's lived experiences and that they're very real. And when we hear people's lived experiences as a man, it feels really uncomfortable. Yeah. And so being a man, and I think that's another thing men need to do, they need to be uncomfortable. Recognizing male privilege, white privilege, all these sorts of things requires a level of discomfort. And I think I often see the rhetoric and the narrative of we feel unsafe. Well, I don't think people are unsafe. I think they're uncomfortable, and we love to blend the two. So I think men sitting in discomfort, listening to women. I think we need to get away from these ideas and binaries of good men and bad men. I think it's really unhelpful. Men using family violence are not these monsters out there hiding. They're everyday men in all of our workplaces, in all of our communities. They're very charming, they're very likable. And so I think we need to dispel that idea and really recognize that while we know not all men use violence, all men are privileged and benefit from a society that privileges them just because they're men. And so I think taking some recognition of that is part of that. Losing that binary is part of it. I got a list a mile long, but I'll add a couple more quick ones. Having conversations with your mates. If people are saying racist, sexist, homophobic things, we need to call it out, challenge it. We need to be curious. We don't come in like a ton of bricks and dominate people, but we be curious. We ask open questions. We invite reflection. We don't want men to become the knights in shining armor coming in to protect and save women. We want men to kind of be supporting and working alongside women, being allies, if you will, is the language that's often used. And then I think there's a really important piece on men doing some education, reading, consuming books, texts by women of color, trans women, and hearing their stories, and then doing some self-reflection. A beautiful question I remember a friend asked me many, many moons ago. She was like, how do you know you're a man? Put your physical body aside. How do you know that you're a man? And just starting to unpack those things and understand what masculinity means to us as men, and having conversations with our mates and things like that are all starting places. They're not the answer, they're not the fix, but I could ramble on for an hour on this, so I'll leave it there.
No, you're not rambling. Your contributions are great, all of you. I know people are very engaged in this session. I wanted to stay with you, Trent, on a theme that did come up, but before I didn't explore it because there was so many other interesting themes, but I just want to go to it with you now. And it's come up in one of the participants in the forum. Hello to everyone. I know you're watching. I hope this is as compelling for you as it is for me. And the question is this: is there data suggesting the increased level of misogynistic content geared towards our younger generations, males, is impacting levels of violence against women?
Look, JaneMaree mentioned the manosphere before, and the likes of Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson and those kind of men who we're talking about. Of course, in short, I don't know what the evidence tells us directly about that. So I'll answer that short and sweet, but I'll share some reflections as well. Of course, they have some impact. We know they have some impact. But the thing that I find really interesting is people love to kind of point the finger, blame social media, blame Andrew Tate. Let's talk about that. We then get all distracted and go to start talking about those men. To me, those men are just outputs and products of patriarchal culture. Yeah, they're not the cause, but we love to kind of focus in on them and unpack them. And there needs to be research and work done on that. But the thing is, I find, I'll go do work in sporting clubs and I'll have an older man in a room full of younger men who will be enacting all the same patriarchal ideas that I'm actively there trying to teach, alternatives towards. And yet we go on and talk about Andrew Tate without reflecting about the ways that men in our communities, our homes, our schools, our workplaces, that they themselves are also reproducing these really harmful patriarchal ideas of what it means to be a man. And so it's a bit of a cheeky answer. Yes, we need to do work and thinking about how the media is influencing young men, but we can't also distract from the ways that men are being influenced by the very men in our communities at the same time. And which one's more influential? I don't have the answer to that, but I think the point is we need to widen our scope and not get too tunnel visioned.
That's a good point. JaneMaree, I'll just get you on that issue too. You did raise it earlier.
Yeah, so look, I think there is some evidence that there's a dialogue going on that is drawing people in because they're not connecting to something else. I totally agree with Trent that we should, encourage our parliamentarians not to suggest that women prefer to be paid less because they don't have the ambition to be CEOs, as someone was expounding yesterday. And those stereotypes do need to be challenged in everyday life. We look around and, as Trent said, at the sporting clubs, they're going to be run by bloke CEOs. You look at board tables, you look at key positions in almost every part of our society, and we see a patriarchal culture at work. I do think there is some licensing going on around particular types of thinking and language. But I'd recommend Michael Flood's work if people are interested in looking at what's happening with young men and attitudes. His entire career has been directed towards understanding young men and thinking about what's happening. So it is a really complicated picture, but reading and thinking misogynistic language and talk just can't be good for anyone. It runs against what we're trying to achieve. So I think we can generally say, a bit like eating KFC every day, just best not to do it, really, or to try and turn the volume down.
Definitely more salad is what you're saying. So let's just get some practical points from you if we can, JaneMaree, and then I'm going to take a whole lot of questions from our participants. But just in terms of some practical things, I know that you think that families need to talk more about, for instance, money and controlling a bit of this before, but some of these strategies that we should be implementing in our lives.
Yeah, look, I think the research is really pointing to economic abuse as being a part of every family violence situation. Adolescent parent, intimate partner, LGBTIQA plus relationships experiencing violence, that money's really important in our society. And so I think, a bit like your great-grandmother, who was clearly a woman ahead of her time,
Totally.
saying to people, whatever work you do, whether it's paid or not paid, it's actually contributing to survival. So don't talk smack to your mother, because you might think she's at home changing nappies and all that kind of stuff, but that baby's not going to do well if she doesn't do that. So we've all got a role to play in surviving and thriving. The distribution of money is uneven in our society. So I think the more that families talk about that, so it's not that dad brings home the money and mum does the washing. Well, those things are interlinked. And as you said, having a stash is really important, because economic abuse is the beginning of the family violence relationship, any type of intimate partner violence. Not having money stops you getting out. So there's a really good argument for talking about that financial independence and a bit of financial literacy as part of what goes on. The other thing that I think is really good is workplaces, community centres, they all have to have family violence policies. It's just good to spend 10 minutes reading them because you know the phone number and you might see something that, you know, a bit like Julianne said, makes you think, oh, my friend Sarah, I don't know, she seems to be a bit caught up in some of this stuff. You know, it just, and sometimes if someone asks, you might know, you might recognise your own experience, you might be able to offer someone else some kindness around it. And I think those are just really practical, everyday things. Just be informed, it'll take 10 minutes.
Mm. Now, I'm going to go to some questions now. Julianne, just on this, we've got a question here that says, what support can friends and family offer to the victims of abuse? And I thought we'd start with you if we could, Julianne, on that, because as a survivor of domestic and family violence, what would have been helpful for you? I mean, I think a lot of us, this would be really resonant right now. I think we all know somebody who we either suspect or know is enduring family violence. What can we do?
Well, I think quite often, well, for myself, I tried to keep it as hidden as I possibly could, because quite often if a friend does say something and that's overheard by the perpetrator, it's going to make everything a whole lot worse. I think believe what they say. Don't probe for details. Don't try and make their choice for them. Let them know that when they're ready, that you will fully support them and help them in any way they can. Obviously, if you can, educate them, give them service numbers, things like that. But be very careful not to change too much, especially if you've got a relationship with both the perpetrator and the victim, because perpetrators, they can sense the moment you decide that you're going to leave, there's something that is unspoken that is picked up, and they can smell it a mile away. And this is one of the reasons it's so dangerous at this time. So be very, very aware of how dangerous it is. And quite often when you actually have to escape, I don't like to say leave, when you want to escape, quite often you have to just take a risk when there's an opportune moment. And that's how most women have to do it. It's not this, okay, I'm going to meet this service, I've decided I'm going to leave Frank on Wednesday. It just doesn't happen like that for most women. You know, it could be, well, for me, I was his full-time job. He would have to watch me 24/7, time how long it took me to walk my daughter to school and get back. And if it was longer than 7 minutes, he would come looking. So you've got to think it's not that easy for all women. Some women can leave easily, but for most women, it's a very tricky situation. And I think if you just your behavior is just exactly the same as it's always been, but just let them know that when they're ready, you're there.
That's great advice. I want to throw a question back to you if I can, Trent. And it's a great question. Good luck with it. I'm a single mum of 2 young boys, 4 and 8. How do I teach them not to be violent and disrespectful when they have so much energy all the time and are constantly wrestling each other and sometimes me?
Yeah, great question. I'm not sure if others on the panel might be able to help out because I'm not a parent, so I don't have that lived experience of parenting. You know, I just think about the power of role modeling. That's something that comes up in my mind all the time. I was even delivering some training yesterday, and we were doing an activity where people think about equitable and caring ways of relating to others, or dominating ways of relating to others. And people were saying the ways that their positive experiences, even though there are far fewer of experiencing care and love and respectful ways of being, had much had a really profound impact on them. And often that was a driving force for them to try and do better in their own lives. And so I'll throw to other panelists potentially if there's any parenting tips in there. But I think I wouldn't understate the power of just role modeling and being there and parenting in a way that aligns with your values and ethics. Yeah.
JaneMaree?
We don't have much room for mums to say, I don't like that, I won't do this, I want something different, I would prefer it if you didn't. And I think it's not a muscle that mums are encouraged to develop, but as Julianne said, it's a really important one. So if the wrestling's good for you, enjoy. If you don't like it, you can't always stop people doing the things they want to do, but saying, I really don't like that, it makes me feel uncomfortable or sad, but there's no
Setting those boundaries
yeah,
to what you were talking
I
about
don't
before.
think there's any easy ways.
No, Julianne?
Yeah, look, my opinion might be a little bit different than others. Like, there are some differences with boys and girls that is, biological. And I think why it's okay to have everybody act the same way, it shouldn't be scout on. Quite often, look, I had a boy that did the girl things and the girl that did the boy things, but at different ages. And my girl could be just as rough and tumble as my son, sometimes more so. But if it comes to where they're hurting each other, sometimes, like, boys can or kids in general can be quite competitive siblings. So let them arm wrestle instead of wrestling. Who's going to get to 6 hoops first in basketball? Like, let them be competitive with each other, but they have to be good losers, good winners, and there's a big lesson there. But you can sort of distract the physical violence and put it somewhere else. Like, I've had to do so many things when my kids were really going at each other and I could hear them and I'd be in another room. I'd call the house phone with my mobile and I'd hear them run and pick it up and there'd be no one there. And my daughter would say, who was it? My son said, I don't know. And all of a sudden they're like, who keeps ringing? And they're like, they've forgotten all about their argument. I'm sitting there going, it's me, But sometimes it's just can be just like so much emotion and not knowing how to let it out in a good way. Sometimes I'd give my son the what do you call it? The totem tennis pole. And I'd say, if you're angry, go and hit the tree. You don't punch doors, you don't do any of that. You're angry, go get it out on the tree. That worked for me. It mightn't work for everyone, but you sort of got to get creative. But every opportunity you've got to show them that there's a different way.
A great question here that I'd love to put to you, JaneMaree, and it's, what is an area in gendered violence that isn't given enough attention?
I think adolescent family violence is on the agenda, but I still think it's a pretty poorly served area. There's not many services. People have to wait a really long time. And I think this is a place where our gendered ideas about parents really come to play in a pretty difficult way. So I think, we don't need to blame mothers who are experiencing violence from their kids. They're already well there in front of us feeling that they've done something wrong. So I think that supporting and believing women who experience violence in those ways, I think we're much less likely to now say about an adult male partner, that's not likely to be true. But to be afraid in your own house of your own kids, that's really hard. And I think we can look at some things about that. I think we still don't have a good picture on how we support women in refugee and migrant communities. You know, we often have this default to culture, but actually it's often services that don't have translators or assumptions, or the migration system, which is really punishing in a whole lot of ways. So I think for me, those are areas that I work in, and I do think we can, but I'm really going to bet that there's lots and lots of places we haven't yet begun to think about, actually.
Yeah, inevitably. Trent?
Yeah, I would echo exactly what JaneMaree said at the end there, that kind of understanding the complexities of people's lives based on race, gender, Aboriginality, all of these sorts of things. We need to be better at responding and understanding those complexities. You know, even tonight, much of our conversation is being focused on gender inequality, which we know is the key driver of family violence, but we know those other forms of oppression, white supremacy and racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, they're all inextricably linked together. And, you know, I think sometimes I imagine, you know, if we had this beautiful world where we smashed the patriarchy and we had gender equality, we would still have Aboriginal women experiencing violence from colonization. We'd still have women of colour experiencing white supremacist violence, still have disabled women experiencing ableism. And so I think for me, it's around, we need to call out the sexism, yeah, but we've also got to call out the racism and the homophobia, and making sure that our movement and our work, whether we're community members or practitioners, is really trying to create a safer, equal society for all of us, and for the conversation not just to be about gender.
I've got another good question, and this one is, what advice do you have for teachers who are educating students about gendered violence, but the messaging from home might be the complete opposite of what we're teaching? JaneMaree?
This is a really tricky one, I reckon, and I feel a bit lucky that I work with young adults where there's a little bit more space from the home situation. I think you have to model the respect and openness. So you have to say, wow, that's an interesting perspective. Does anyone else have a different idea? What makes you think of that? So you do, like, I think, language and terminology, trying to say to people, okay, this is what we mean when we say this and that, you know, what's the difference between gender and sex? So you start to give a bit of a language to young people, but you have to respect and understand the differences and not get caught up in thinking you've got answers. And I think the more that you can do that, actually, the more likely you are to support that young person to think differently. Like, you can't say, wow, your mum and dad have got it all wrong. I mean, other than all mums and dads basically having it wrong pretty much most of the time, but you can, you know, you can offer alternates. Okay, that's really interesting. There's this view, there's that view, and encourage them in that way. But it's hard. Such admiration for teachers. It's really important work, and it's just crowded and noisy, and we expect a lot.
This is another one, which is, I think, vaguely linked, perhaps, yeah, linked, not the same. Trent, how to discuss the impact of family violence with adult sons and adult men without them getting defensive?
Great question. I think, to JaneMaree's point, curiosity is beautiful. Curiosity is one of the best tools in this work. Asking open questions, inviting reflection, really powerful. I'm reminded of the work of Alan Jenkins, he's a men's family violence theorist and practitioner. And he's talking about his own work, but I think about it in the primary prevention context all the time. And he says, what does it mean if we're asking something from men? We're asking something from them that we're not offering them ourselves. I.e., when we're having these conversations with men, we're asking them to listen to us. We're asking them to take on board what we're talking about. We're asking them to reflect on our experiences and women's perspectives. And I think, you know, when I think about engaging men and really engaging men, like I'm not doing this to blow hot air around it. I really want to create change. And so there needs to be a space of a conversation and listening. And I think often men become very defensive when they feel like they're being spoken at. And some of that's that uncomfort versus unsafe dynamic that I spoke about, where we do need to invite men to feel uncomfortable. But I also know there are spaces where people do attack and shame and make men to feel guilt and bad. That's not going to get us anywhere. And I think if we take that conversational approach where we're listening and trying to engage really mutually, that's kind of the best answer I have, at least in my work to date.
Julianne, do you have any reflections on that? Because I do think there is a way to have these conversations that tries to remove some of the stigma or the defensiveness. And it's a tricky thing, isn't it, Trent? Like, it's not an easy thing to do. And sometimes people can think you're being judgmental when you don't want to be. But are there ways that you can try and have the conversations that work better than others?
Yeah. When I think back of when we went through that spate of Howard punching, there was a whole heap of it. Then we had these really prominent male figures come on TV, like Anthony Mundine, and just saying, it's not cool, guys, to do that. We had such a drop in coward punching. So it sort of makes you think, like, some men are quite happy to listen to women, but maybe a lot of men don't want to be spoken about men's problems by women. So I just think if we had more prominent males as role models stepping up and just saying, this is not okay. And I think another thing too, like when I think about my own journey, it's one thing to say this is not okay and this is not okay. But someone who comes from a dysfunctional family, we don't know what okay looks like. So we need to start doing that in schools. It's like, okay, so I know that that's not okay. So what would okay look like? What is that other way that you do it respectfully? Or, because like for me and a lot of people, we haven't seen the right behavior growing up. So we have no idea. So I think it's really important. It's like, well, if you're not going to scream at her, let me just show you a different way that you could come to a resolution, because sometimes men and women don't actually know. We've never had it demonstrated as children how you resolve conflicts. So I think that's important, and I think go a long way with starting to focus more on men, because as a woman, I don't think there's anything more I can do to protect myself apart from walking around in a cage. And I think it's important for men to start to hear what it does to their children as well, because they're fathers, So I think it's so important that, they can see. Imagine if this was your little girl. This is possibly what could happen. You could find your daughter dead one day in a boarding house. So, yeah, I think we need to get more practical and sort of think outside the box a bit more.
Thank you. JaneMaree, there's a great question here. How do we counter disrespect in practical and safe ways?
Depends a bit on context, I think. So sometimes humour works well, sometimes, but sometimes being quiet is the best thing and walking away because you're really not safe to have a go. Telling someone else is also good. It is really, really hard, I think, to stand up and say, look, I really found the way that you spoke to me awful. Like even just saying it, pretending I'm saying it makes me feel not so good. But I think when someone does that, supporting that as well. So you need to think about what you feel okay about. And you also definitely don't need to feel that you have to get on your charger every time. You say when you can, and if you're not safe enough to do it or in a place where you can, that's really okay too. And sometimes going to someone afterward and saying, I'm really sorry I didn't say anything, but I did think that was absolutely yucky, is really validating for the person, because it means they don't go home thinking, oh my goodness, I live in an alternate universe where I think that's awful. So you don't have to go the shush all the time. There's a few, but yeah.
Just go back to the big question around men, and Trent, to you, how do we motivate men to attend education programs?
Yeah, it's a great question. In a lot of the work I do, I'm mostly delivering to women. I'm often the irony of preaching to the choir. Um, I think I guess I have a few ways to answer the question. I think obviously how we engage men needs to be nuanced. This isn't about selling this to men and showing what's in it for them. But when you read the work of bell hooks and people like that, they show us how harmful patriarchy is for men. When we talk about gender stereotypes, they're harmful for women. They're incredibly harmful for men. The high rates of male suicide that we have in this country are horrific. They're caused by the same harmful gender stereotypes that driving and causing men to kill women, and they're killing themselves. So there's certainly a case in there for showing men the benefits that are to it. I think about lots of the training that I do in workplaces where I'm going in and doing kind of mandatory sexual harassment training, and also using that as an opportunity to bring in conversations about gender and gender inequality, and getting people to reflect on that. It's really powerful when workplaces take a strong position and they say that, this is mandatory. And so I think, that's not answering the question, because the question was how do we motivate men to get into them. But I think there's a role for leaders within our organization to take strong positions on this and say, hey, we care about this, we want everyone to do it. And when you've got a good training provider, getting them in the door is one thing, engaging them is the next thing. That's a whole different kettle of fish. But recently too, I've had some experiences of facilitating some men's only spaces where men are able to come in. We do pretty much the same content we do as all other groups, or mixed gender groups. And it is really interesting the way that men engage in those groups. They, I wouldn't say they're resistant, but they feel a little more open to us what they're thinking. And as a facilitator, I want to know what people are thinking. And so that's been a new interesting space for me. As facilitators, how we hold women's stories and experiences very central and present in those men's open spaces is very important, to make sure we're not colluding with men's violence. But that's a little, my mind just went off a rabbit hole because it was a recent experience for me, and it was really fascinating the way that men engage in those spaces. I could ramble on, but
No, that was really, really interesting. Look, I've got a final question that I'd love all of you to address, and I'm going to begin with you, Julianne. And it's again from one of the participants in this excellent webinar. And the question is this: what can we do as citizens, as community members, to help start or change the conversation? If you could give us one thing we can do, what would it be?
I think educate yourselves. I say it all the time, you only know what you know. And I think it's everyone's responsibility to educate yourselves. You don't need to go get a diploma, but just be aware of what's happening to people in your own community, and look at ways where you could start to have contact with people in the community.
Thank you. JaneMaree?
I guess give in the ways that you can. I'm thinking of the $10 to the organisations that are operating on the smell of an oily rag, the being present, coming to webinars like this on a Tuesday night when you're probably a tiny bit fried and there's other things you could be doing. So just taking those opportunities, because symbolically that says this is important, it's important to me. And as Julianne said, you're kind of listening. When you're thinking about your parliamentarians and your local council and all those things, there are a kind of a myriad of decisions every day that we make that do signal that we think something's really important. And maybe as citizens, those are things that we can also think about to do.
Yeah, mine's a little bit of an extension of Julianne's point is educate ourselves, learn. Often people want to go out there and fix it and change it, but often not as keen to look at ourselves and think about the changes that we might need to make in our own blind spots. because Julianne also kind of answered that, I'll give us a part two. There's a book that I highly recommend. It's called The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity and Love by Bell Hooks. I've had this book here because almost every question that has come up, I've wanted to go, oh yeah, Bell says this about that in this book. It's $25, $24, something like that online. This book is really powerful, especially for all the questions that came in around engaging men, thinking about men and masculinities. The Will to Change by Bell Hooks certainly changed my life personally and professionally. So when I say educate yourself, this is what to go and read.
Beautifully said, and I couldn't agree more. I back that one up to have read it. It is very good. And there is so much amazing literature. Look, can I just say, your contributions have been really powerful. I've got one idea too. I wasn't meant to ask myself, but share like this. We've recorded this, share it with people. Not everyone can turn up at the time tonight, but share it with people. Like, I just think not to say that Trent and JaneMaree weren't amazing, but just even watching Julianne's contribution and thinking about your own experience perhaps that you might be having with violence, or your sister might be having with violence, or your best mate might be having with violence, I think can be quite an enabler for thinking differently about what you can do. I'm going to throw now to Yelena. It's been an excellent conversation. I don't think we should only have it during these periods. I think we should constantly be having these conversations, but it is good that we have the opportunity to kind of focus our attention. Yelena?
Thank you so much, Patricia, and the panel. I totally agree that these conversations shouldn't be just only once a year. Let's have them every day, and let's have them with our close friends, family, colleagues, and community members. And, it's 8:59, so thank you everyone who stayed that late and listened to our conversation. This is all we have the time for today, and I would like to thank all our amazing speakers, Patricia, Trent, Julianne, JaneMaree. Thank you so much for contributing your experience and your knowledge. So thank you. Unfortunately, we have to turn off the webinar very soon, and we will be grateful if you could fill out the survey. That surveys help us to build our work and continue our work for the community. It will not take very long. It's about 5 minutes to respond to the survey, but we will also send the follow-up email. I also would like to thank Kath, Dana, Felicity, Annette, Liz, and Tracy from Monash, Knox, and Maroondah councils who have contributed, and we're working on the background. So there are things that are happening and they're not very visible for the audience. So thank you so much for all your help. And this brings us to the end of our event tonight. Thank you again to Safe and Equal and Respect Victoria, and also the Victorian Government for supporting us through the Free from Violence local governments program. And again, huge thank you to Julianne, JaneMaree, and Trent, and Patricia. Good night, everyone.